The crystal chandelier above Table 7 had been imported from Venice in 1987, the same year Chairman Park Jin-woo opened the Lotus Garden as Seoul's most exclusive dining establishment. Now, 38 years later, it cast the same prismatic light across white tablecloths where billion-won deals were sealed over perfectly aged Hanwoo beef and century-old baijiu. The restaurant occupied the entire 53rd floor of the Gangnam Finance Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Seoul that made visitors feel like gods surveying their domain. Tonight, those windows reflected the warm glow of strategically placed lamps and the cold gleam of silverware that cost more than most people's monthly rent. G1 moved between the tables like water finding its path through stones, fluid, purposeful, nearly invisible. At 28, she had perfected the art of being present without being seen, of anticipating needs before they were voiced, of reading the room's temperature through the pitch of laughter and the spaces between words. Her black uniform was impeccable, her hair pulled back in a bun so tight it gave her headaches by the end of each shift, her smile professional and distant as the moon. Ji-won had been working at Lotus Garden for 3 years, ever since her mother's medical bills had transformed from a manageable stream into a crushing flood. If you're enjoying this story of hidden knowledge and class struggle, please like and share. It only takes a second, but helps stories like this reach people who need to hear them. The restaurant paid well, exceptional by industry standards, but it demanded everything in return. 14-hour shifts were common. Days off were theoretical concepts that appeared on schedules but disappeared when important clients needed service. The staff bathroom had a small couch where servers sometimes slept between the lunch and dinner rushes, too exhausted to make the journey home, only to return hours later. Tonight was a Friday, which meant the private dining rooms were all occupied by corporate giants and political powers. Ji-won had been assigned to the main floor, a demotion of sorts after she'd accidentally made eye contact with a minister's wife 2 weeks ago. In places like Lotus Garden, invisibility was valued above competence. She had broken that cardinal rule, and now she paid for it, by serving the slightly less powerful, the merely wealthy, rather than the untouchable elite. Table 7 was hosting a party of 6 from the Hansong Group, one of the nation's top 5 chaebols. Ji-won had served them once before, 6 months ago, though she doubted any of them would remember her face. The head of the table was Park Daunting, the second son of the Hansong chairman, a man in his early 50s whose tailored suit probably cost more than a year of her salary. His hair was silver at the temples, in a way that suggested distinction rather than age, and his watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the light every time he lifted his wine glass. The 2015 Chateau Margaux. My father purchased an entire case at auction last year. He claims it's investment, but really, he just wants to drink history. The man around the table laughed with the precise volume and duration that indicated their position in the hierarchy. Too loud would suggest equality. Too soft would imply disagreement. They had learned this language in business schools and boardrooms, had practiced it until it became as natural as breathing. Ji-won approached with a silver tray bearing their appetizers, delicate portions of Wagyu carpaccio garnished with gold leaf and microgreens grown in the restaurant's rooftop garden. She set them down with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed, starting with Park Daunting and moving clockwise according to protocol. "Anything else for now, sir?" she asked, in the standard Seoul dialect, her voice modulated to be heard but not intrusive. Park Daunting didn't look at her. "No. Return in 15 minutes." She bowed slightly and retreated, but she didn't go far. Good servers at Lotus Garden learned to hover at the periphery, close enough to respond instantly, but far enough to maintain the illusion of privacy. She positioned herself near the wine station, her eyes tracking 3 tables at once, her mind calculating timing and need with the precision of a chess master planning moves ahead. That's when she heard it. Park Daunting had started speaking again, but now his voice had changed. The modern Seoul accent had fallen away, replaced by something that made the hair on Ji-won's neck stand up. The vowels were rounded differently. The consonants softened or hardened in patterns that no longer existed in contemporary Korean. She had been working at Lotus Garden for 3 years, ever since her mother's medical bills had transformed from a manageable stream into a crushing flood. He had started speaking again, but now his voice had changed. The modern Seoul accent had fallen away, replaced by something that made the hair on Ji-won's neck stand up. The vowels were rounded differently. The consonants softened or hardened in patterns that no longer existed in contemporary Korean. He had been speaking Hangul as it might have been spoken 600 years ago during the early Joseon dynasty, mixing it with classical Chinese phonetics in a way that suggested deep study of historical linguistics. 선생님이 가르쳐 주신 것을 기억하고 계십니까? His pronunciation of 선생님 used an archaic honorific structure, and the verb ending was from Middle Korean before the great vowel shift of the 16th century. The other men at the table shifted uncomfortably. One of them, younger than the rest, laughed nervously. Dajang Hyungnim, I didn't study classical Korean. My father insisted on English and Mandarin.
Park Dae-jung smiled, clearly pleased with himself. This is how the Yongbans spoke when Korea had culture, before we became American puppets speaking their language in our own country. My tutor at Cambridge specialized in historical Korean linguistics. I pay him 200 million won a year to preserve what we're losing. He continued in that archaic speech, showing off now, weaving in classical Chinese characters pronounced in the Korean way, using grammatical structures that had been dead for centuries. It was impressive, Ji-won had to admit. Most wealthy Koreans couldn't speak proper English despite their expensive education abroad. This man had invested time and money into learning a version of his own language that existed mainly in historical texts. But he was getting it wrong. Not dramatically wrong. His tutor was clearly knowledgeable. But there were small errors, the kind that only someone who had studied extensively would notice. He was using a verb conjugation from the Goryeo period in a sentence structure from the Joseon era. His pronunciation of certain vowels was based on how modern scholars thought Middle Korean sounded, but recent archaeological evidence suggested those theories were incorrect. He had mixed up two nearly identical grammatical particles that changed the entire meaning of his sentence from respect for teachers to respect for merchants, an embarrassing mistake that his companions wouldn't catch, but that would make a real scholar wince. Ji-won felt her fingers curl into her palm. She had written her master's thesis on exactly this subject, the evolution of Korean honorific language from the Goryeo through the early Joseon period. She had spent 2 years at Seoul National University poring over documents, learning to read Hangul in its earliest forms, studying the phonetic shifts that occurred as the language evolved. Her thesis had been praised by Professor Kim Sun-jae, one of the nation's foremost linguistic historians, who had encouraged her to continue to a PhD. That was before she had to choose between her own future and her mother's present. She watched Park Dae-jung continue his performance, saw how the other men nodded even though they clearly didn't understand, observed how he paused after certain phrases to let the weight of his knowledge settle over the table like expensive perfume. He was using language as a weapon, as another way to establish dominance, to prove that his wealth had purchased something beyond material goods. It had bought him access to Korea's cultural heritage, to a past that belonged to everyone, but that only the rich could afford to study. The 15 minutes passed. Ji-won returned to the table, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "Are you ready to order your main courses, sir?" Park Dae-jung glanced at her, and for the first time that evening, he seemed to actually see her. Perhaps it was the angle of the light, or maybe something in her posture had shifted infinitesimally. "The Hanwoo stripe loin medium rare, and bring another bottle of Margot." Of course, sir. She was turning to leave when he spoke again in that archaic Korean, this time directing his words at her, testing her as one might test a servant's literacy by handing them a book. "Gidenen I model aradiddle sui simnika." The table went quiet. The other men watched with the anticipation of spectators at a blood sport. This was entertainment for them, watching their superior toy with the help, seeing how she would handle being addressed in a language she couldn't possibly understand. Ji-won stopped. Her supervisor's warnings echoed in her mind. Never engage, never presume, never ever step outside your role. She had worked so hard to be invisible, to be the perfect servant, to swallow her education and her pride for the sake of her mother's medicine, for the sake of keeping this job that, despite everything, paid better than any alternative available to her. But Park Dae-jung's pronunciation was wrong again. He'd used a verb form that didn't exist, and had essentially asked her, "Do you understand this speech?" His expensive tutor had evidently never explained that particular grammatical structure. She felt something crack inside her chest, like ice breaking on a river in early spring.
Ji-won turned back to the table and met Park Dae-jung's eyes. When she spoke, her voice remained level, professional, but the words that came out were not in modern Korean. They were in Middle Korean, properly conjugated with the correct vowel sounds based on the latest archaeological research, using grammatical structures that Park Dae-jung had attempted but failed to master. Sambay님께서 말씀하시는 것을 알아제옵니다. 그러나 선배님께서 사용하시는 어미와 조사들은 고려시대와 조선시대의 고들이 혼합되어 있습니다. 또한 알아들을 데 있습니까? 라는 표현은 조시대에 존재하지 않았습니다. The effect was instantaneous and total. Park Dae-jung's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, shock, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear. The other men at the table stared at Ji-won as if she had suddenly sprouted wings. One of them dropped his fork, and it clattered against the plate with a sound that seemed thunderous in the silence. She had told him, in perfect archaic Korean, that she understood what he was trying to say, but that he was mixing grammatical structures from different historical periods, and that the phrase, "Can you understand this?" didn't exist in that form during the era he was attempting to reference. She had corrected him. Not just corrected him, she had demonstrated superior knowledge in the very field he was using to establish his cultural superiority. Park Dae-jung's face slowly flushed red. Around them, Ji-won became aware that other tables had grown quiet, that other diners were craning their necks to see what was happening at table 7. She could see her supervisor, Mr. Kang, near the kitchen entrance, his expression one of pure horror as he witnessed a server, his server, speaking to a Chaebol heir in a manner that violated every rule of the establishment. "How dare you?" Park Dae-jung said, his voice low and dangerous. He had switched back to modern Korean, all pretense of scholarly discussion abandoned. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am?" Ji-won's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I apologize, sir. I was merely trying to— You were merely trying to embarrass me. In front of my colleagues, in front of everyone here." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Where did a waitress learn to speak like that? What kind of presumption makes you think you have the right to correct me?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Ji-won felt the weight of every eye in the restaurant on her. She had done exactly what she'd sworn never to do. She had become visible. Worse, she had become a problem. Mr. Kang was hurrying over now, his face pale, already bowing an apology before he even reached the table. But before he could arrive, before Ji-won could attempt to salvage the situation, one of the other men at the table spoke up. "Dae-chung-shi. Perhaps she studied Korean literature. Some universities still teach classical forms. Universities? Park Dae-jung laughed, but there was no humor in it. Look at her. She's a waitress. She probably finished high school and thought that was enough. You think someone working here has a university education? She probably picked up a few phrases from television and decided to play scholar. Ji-won's hands trembled, and she clasped them behind her back to hide it. She wanted to tell him that she graduated from Seoul National University with honors, that her undergraduate thesis on the evolution of Korean honorifics in royal correspondence had won the departmental prize, that she had been accepted into the master's program with a full scholarship, that Professor Kim had called her the most promising linguistic researcher he had seen in a decade. She wanted to tell him that she could read Hangul in all its historical forms, that she could trace the phonetic changes of any word from Old Korean through to modern usage, that she had spent countless nights in the university library with 15th century texts learning to see patterns that other researchers had missed. She wanted to tell him that she had given it all up, not because she wasn't good enough, but because her mother's cancer had returned, because the experimental treatments weren't covered by insurance, because someone had to pay the bills and her father had died when she was 12, because she made a choice that shattered her own dreams to extend her mother's life by months or maybe years. But she said none of this, because Mr. Kang had arrived and he was bowing so deeply his forehead nearly touched the table, and he was apologizing with the desperation of a man who knew his job depended on satisfying this customer. And Ji-won understood that anything she said now would only make things worse. "I am so sorry, sir. This is completely unacceptable. Ji-won-shi, apologize immediately. Bow and apologize."
Ji-won bowed 90 degrees, the formal bow of deep apology. "I sincerely apologize, sir. My behavior was inappropriate and disrespectful. Please forgive my rudeness." But Park Dae-jung wasn't satisfied. He grabbed his wine glass and drained it, then set it down with enough force that the stem cracked. "I want her fired, immediately. I won't have my evening ruined by some presumptuous girl who thinks she's better than her station." "Of course, sir, of course," Mr. Kang said. "Ji-won-si, you're dismissed. Go clean out your locker. You're terminated, effective immediately." The words hit Ji-won like physical blows. Fired. 3 years of perfect service, erased in a moment. All because she couldn't stop herself from correcting someone who was using her language as a luxury item to display. She bowed again, this time to Mr. Kang, then to the table at large. When she straightened, she made the mistake of meeting Park Dae-jung's eyes one more time. He was smiling now, satisfied that order had been restored, that the servant had been put in her place. As Ji-won walked toward the staff area, she heard him resume speaking to his table in modern Korean, his voice jovial now. "You see, this is the problem with our country. Everyone thinks they deserve respect. They don't understand that hierarchy exists for a reason. Some people are meant to lead, others to serve. You can't change the natural order of things." The other servers parted for her as she moved through the restaurant, their faces sympathetic but distant. They couldn't afford to be associated with her failure. In places like Lotus Garden, disgrace was contagious. In the staff locker room, Ji-won sat on the small couch where she'd napped so many times between shifts. Her hands were shaking now that she was alone, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation beginning to ebb. She thought of her mother sleeping in their small apartment, of the bills due next week, of how she would explain losing the best job she'd likely ever have. Her phone buzzed. A text from Soo-min, another waitress who worked the private dining rooms. "What happened? Everyone's talking about it. Are you okay?" She didn't respond. She opened her locker and began pulling out her things. An extra pair of shoes, some makeup, a sweater for when the air conditioning made the restaurant too cold. At the bottom was a book, worn and highlighted. The Evolution of Korean Honorific Systems, 918 to 1592. She'd kept it there as a talisman, a reminder of who she had been before she became invisible. She held the book against her chest and allowed herself exactly 60 seconds to feel the full weight of what had happened, the injustice of it, the humiliation, the waste of it all. Her education, her talent, her years of study, all meaningless because they weren't accompanied by the right last name, the right connections, the right amount of money. Then she dried her eyes, put the book in her bag, and left Lotus Garden for the last time. She didn't know that 3 people in the restaurant had filmed the confrontation on their phones. She didn't know that one of them, a junior reporter for a major newspaper who'd been dining with his editor, had recognized the sophistication of her archaic Korean and the wrongness of Park Daung's response. She didn't know that by tomorrow morning, the video would be viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, that by tomorrow afternoon, journalists would be trying to identify the Lotus Garden waitress who spoke Middle Korean, that by tomorrow evening, her life would change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. All she knew, as she walked out into the cold November night, was that she had lost everything: her job, her pride, her ability to care for her mother. The streets of Gangnam glittered around her with wealth she would never possess, with opportunities she would never access, with a future that seemed to have closed its doors permanently. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind and began the long journey home to Nowon-gu, where her mother waited, where the bills waited, where reality waited, with all its crushing weight. This story is just getting started. If you want to see how Jiwon's courage changes everything, hit that subscribe button. Your support takes just 1 click, but makes all the difference. The apartment in Nowon-gu was on the 4th floor of a building that had been constructed in the late 1980s, when Korea's economy was booming and developers had thrown up housing blocks with more speed than care. The elevator had been broken for 6 months, a detail the landlord acknowledged with vague promises of soon that had long ago lost any connection to actual time. Jiwon climbed the stairs slowly, her feet aching from the 14-hour shift that had ended in catastrophe, her mind still replaying the scene at table 7 in exhausting detail. She paused at the 3rd-floor landing, not because she needed to catch her breath, but because she needed to prepare her face. Her mother had an uncanny ability to read her emotions, a skill honed over 28 years of motherhood and sharpened by illness into something almost supernatural. She couldn't walk through the door with defeat written across her features. She would need to lie, and lies required the right expression.
She practiced smiling. It felt like pulling muscles that no longer remembered their function. The apartment was dark when she entered, just past midnight. Her mother's bedroom door was closed, and Jiwon could hear the faint hum of the air purifier she'd bought last year, a machine that filtered out the pollution that seemed to aggravate her mother's breathing. The living room was small, just large enough for a couch, a television, and a low table where they took their meals. The kitchenette occupied one corner, separated from the living space by a counter barely wide enough to hold a cutting board. Jiwon had grown up in this apartment. Her father had carried her through that door when she was 3 days old, her mother exhausted but radiant beside him. She had done her homework at that low table, had watched her father read his newspaper on that couch, had stood in that kitchenette learning to make kimchi under her mother's patient instruction. After her father's heart attack, sudden, cruel, taking him between one breath and the next, the apartment had simultaneously become a shrine to his memory and a prison of financial constraint. She dropped her bag by the door and moved quietly to the kitchen. Despite everything, she was hungry. She hadn't eaten since her lunch break, a hurried meal of leftover rice and kimchi consumed in the staff room between rushes. She opened the refrigerator and surveyed its contents: vegetables for soup, eggs, some leftover banchan, a container of rice. Simple things. Cheap things. Her mother insisted on doing the grocery shopping despite her illness, maintaining this one piece of normalcy, but Ji-won knew she chose items based on price first, nutrition second. As she reached for the eggs, she heard her mother's bedroom door open. "Ji-won-ah, you're home late." Her mother's voice was soft, roughened by the breathing treatments she had to do 3 times a day. Ji-won turned, forcing brightness into her expression. "Oma, I'm sorry. I tried to be quiet. Did I wake you?" Her mother emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in the pink flannel robe that had been a gift from Ji-won 3 Christmases ago. At 56, Park Mi-son had once been vibrant, energetic, the kind of woman who could work a full shift at the textile factory and still have energy to prepare elaborate dinners. Cancer had whittled her down to something more delicate, more translucent. Her hair, still recovering from the last round of chemotherapy, was thin and gray. But her eyes remained sharp, concerned, immediately cataloging everything about her daughter's appearance. "You didn't wake me. I was just resting, not really sleeping." She moved to the table and sat down slowly, each movement calculated to minimize pain. "Why are you home so early? Friday nights usually keep you until 2 or 3. "Manager let me off early. Slow night." The lie came easier than Ji-won expected. "On a Friday? In Gangnam?" Her eyebrow raised fractionally. "Are you going to tell me what really happened, or should I guess?" Ji-won felt something in her chest tighten. She busied herself with the eggs, cracking them into a bowl, reaching for the salt. "Nothing happened, Oma. Just a slow night." "Ji-won-ah." Her mother's voice held the particular tone that meant she wouldn't be deflected. "I raised you. I know when you're lying. Your left eye twitches, just a little. It always has since you were 6 years old and told me you didn't eat the honey cookies I was saving." Despite everything, Ji-won felt a ghost of a smile. She remembered those cookies. She remembered her mother's patient interrogation, the way she'd eventually confessed through tears, certain she'd committed an unforgivable crime. She abandoned the eggs and came to sit across from her mother at the low table. In the dim light from the kitchen, her mother's face was all planes and shadows, beautiful in the way ancient temple carvings were beautiful, worn but essential, reduced to what mattered most. "I was fired," Ji-won said finally. "Tonight, during dinner service." Her mother's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Why?" "Because I forgot my place." Ji-won laughed, but it came out bitter. "Because I corrected a customer who was showing off his knowledge of classical Korean, and I couldn't stop myself from pointing out his mistakes." She told the whole story then, words spilling out faster as she went. Park Daunting's performance, his errors, the moment when she had broken her own rules, the humiliation that followed, the termination. Her mother listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her breathing slightly labored but steady. When Ji-won finished, silence filled the apartment. Through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbor's television, some late-night drama playing out its predictable conflicts. A motorcycle roared past on the street below. "Your father would have been proud of you," her mother said finally. Ji-won looked up sharply. "Proud? Oma, I just lost our best source of income. The bills."
"Will be dealt with." Her mother reached across the table and took Ji-won's hand. Her fingers were cold, the skin paper-thin. "Your father always said that knowledge without courage was just decoration. You used your knowledge to speak the truth. That's not something to regret. But the practical reality,
The practical reality is that you've been dying slowly for 3 years. Her mother's voice was gentle but firm. Working yourself to exhaustion, pretending you're not educated, not brilliant, not capable of so much more than carrying plates to people who don't see you as human. I've watched you disappear piece by piece. Maybe this firing is the best thing that could have happened. Jiwon pulled her hand back. How can you say that? Your treatment is bankrupting us. Her mother said it without self-pity, just stating a fact. We both know it. Every month we go deeper into debt. Every month you work longer hours. Every month I watch you sacrifice your future for my present. You're my mother. What else would I do? Live your life. Her mother stood slowly, one hand bracing on the table. Jiwon, I'm dying. We both know it. The treatments are just buying time, expensive time. Time that's costing you everything. Don't! Jiwon's voice cracked. Don't talk like that! Someone has to. Her mother moved around the table and placed her hand on Jiwon's head, a gesture from childhood, comforting and heartbreaking. I'm not giving up. I'm not ready to leave you. But I also can't watch you sacrifice everything for a few extra months of my life. Your father and I, we invested everything in your education because we believed you would do something important. We believed you had gifts that needed to be shared with the world. I can go back to university later after I'm gone? Her mother's hand trembled slightly. And how will you pay for it then? You think the debt disappears? You think you won't spend the next decade working to pay off my medical bills? Jiwon stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. She moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Seoul stretching endlessly in every direction. Somewhere out there was Seoul National University, where she'd spent the happiest years of her life. Somewhere out there was the National Library, where she'd discovered a passion for linguistic archaeology, for uncovering the hidden patterns and how Korean had evolved over centuries. Somewhere out there was the life she might have had. I wrote to Professor Kim last week, her mother said quietly. I told him about your situation. I asked him if there was any way you could come back, maybe part-time, maybe as a research assistant. Jiwon spun around. You did what? He wrote back. He said there's a research position opening up next semester. It doesn't pay much, but it would give you access to the university resources. He said he's been following some archaeological discoveries at a temple in Gyeongju. They found documents from the early Joseon period that need translation and analysis. He said he thought of you immediately. Amma, I can't. You can. We'll find a way. I'll talk to Dr. So about reducing the treatment frequency. We'll cut other expenses. Your father's life insurance. There's still a little left. That's your emergency fund. You are my emergency, Jiwon. You giving up your dreams. You disappearing into a job that treats you like you're worthless. That's my emergency. Jiwon felt tears she'd been holding back all night finally break through. She sank onto the couch, her body folding in on itself. Her mother came and sat beside her, pulling her close in a way she hadn't done since Jiwon was a child. They sat like that for a long time, the daughter crying, the mother holding her, both of them aware that time was the enemy they couldn't defeat, but refusing to surrender to despair. I don't know if I can still do it. It's been 3 years. What if I've forgotten everything? What if I'm not good enough anymore? You corrected a rich man's Middle Korean in front of his colleagues, her mother said with a hint of amusement. Jiwon laughed through her tears, a wet, broken sound. That's what got me fired. That's what proved you're still a scholar. Her mother pulled back to look at her. Tomorrow you rest. Tomorrow you remember who you are beyond that uniform. And on Monday, you call Professor Kim. What about money? What about... I'll call Mrs. Han upstairs. She's been asking me to help with her daughter's wedding preparations. I can do that. Address the invitations, help coordinate. It's not much, but it's something. And you could tutor. Rich families pay well for Seoul National University graduates.
I don't have time to tutor if I'm doing research. You'll make time. We'll make it work. Her mother stood, her movements careful but determined. Your father used to say that Koreans survived Japanese colonization, war, poverty, and dictatorship. He said we survive because we're stubborn. We refuse to let circumstances define us. She smiled, tired but genuine. I think it's time we remembered that stubbornness. Ji-won nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mother kissed the top of her head and shuffled back to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. Alone in the living room, Ji-won pulled out her phone. She had 17 missed calls from Suman, 8 text messages from former coworkers, and 3 voicemails. She ignored them all and opened her email instead. She scrolled back 3 years to the last email Professor Kim had sent her. Ji-won, I understand your decision, though it breaks my heart. You have a gift for this work, a way of seeing patterns that others miss, an intuition for the rhythms of language that can't be taught. If circumstances ever change, my door is always open. The field needs people like you. Korea needs people like you. Don't forget that. She had read that email 100 times over the past 3 years, usually late at night when exhaustion had stripped away her defenses and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd lost. Each time it felt like pressing on a bruise, painful and addictive. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like an invitation she might actually be able to accept. She stood and went to the small bookshelf beside the television. Most of the books were her father's, histories of Korea, biographies of independence fighters, and collected works of Korean poets. But on the bottom shelf were hers, linguistic texts, historical grammars, collections of Middle Korean poetry with her annotations in the margins. She pulled out her favorite, a scholarly analysis of the Honmin Cheonggum, the document that had introduced Hangul to Korea in the 15th century. She opened it to a random page and began to read. The words came back to her immediately, as natural as breathing. She had worried that 3 years away had dulled her understanding, but it was all still there. The knowledge, the passion, the ability to lose herself in the evolution of a single syllable across centuries. She read until her eyes grew heavy, until the words blurred on the page. Then she marked her place, returned the book to its shelf, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow she would rest. Tomorrow she would allow herself to imagine a different future. Tomorrow she would begin to remember who she was beyond the invisible waitress in the black uniform. But tonight, just before sleep took her, her phone buzzed one more time. A text message from an unknown number. Is this the waitress from Lotus Garden? The one who spoke Middle Korean? Please call me. I'm a reporter for the Hankyoreh Daily. I think people need to hear your story. Ji-won stared at the message for a long time. Then, without responding, she turned off her phone and closed her eyes, too exhausted to consider what it might mean, too drained to care about anything beyond the oblivion of sleep. In her dreams, she was back at Seoul National University, sitting in Professor Kim's office. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced like golden characters in the air. The professor was speaking, but she couldn't hear the words. She leaned closer, straining to understand, and suddenly she could read the dust itself. Ancient Hangul spelling out messages in the light, the language of her ancestors floating in the air around her, waiting to be deciphered, waiting to be understood. She woke at dawn with the dream still vivid in her mind, and her mother's words echoing in her memory. Don't forget who you are. Ji-won lay in bed and made a decision. She would call Professor Kim. She would reach out to that reporter. She would stop being invisible. Whatever came next, poverty, struggle, failure, it would be on her own terms, using her own voice, speaking her own truth.
She had spent 3 years disappearing. It was time to be seen. The text message from the unknown reporter haunted Ji-won through the weekend. She read it obsessively, trying to decode what "I think people need to hear your story" could possibly mean. Saturday morning, she sat at the low table in her apartment with her phone in her hand and a cup of cheap instant coffee growing cold beside her. Her mother had already left for her breathing treatment at the local clinic, insisting she could manage the bus ride alone despite her protests. The apartment felt too quiet, too small. Every corner held memories she usually kept at bay through exhaustion. Her father reading the newspaper in that chair, her mother cooking dinner in that kitchen, her younger self bent over textbooks at this very table, dreaming of a future that seemed limitless. She typed and deleted responses to the reporter's message 17 times before finally calling Professor Kim instead. "여보세요." His voice was exactly as she remembered, warm, slightly distracted, as if his mind was always partly occupied with some linguistic puzzle. "Professor Kim, this is Lee Ji-won. My mother said she contacted you." There was a pause, then a sound that might have been delight. "Ji-won-ah! Yes, your mother wrote to me. How are you? Are you well?" The simple question threatened to undo her. It's been difficult, Professor." "Your mother mentioned you'd been working. She didn't say where." "A restaurant in Gangnam. She hesitated. "I was fired on Friday night." "Ah." Another pause. "Would this have anything to do with the video that's been circulating online?" Ji-won nearly dropped her phone. "Video? What video?" "You haven't seen it? Ji-won-ah, you're somewhat famous at the moment. Someone filmed an altercation at a high-end restaurant, the Lotus Garden, I believe, between a waitress who spoke perfect Middle Korean and a Chaebol heir who was shown to be less knowledgeable than he claimed. The linguistic community has been quite excited. We're all trying to figure out who this mysterious waitress is." Ji-won's hands began to shake. "How many people have seen it?" "The version I saw had about 300,000 views, but there are several different clips circulating. One of my colleagues shared it in our research group chat. We were all quite impressed with the waitress's command of archaic grammatical structures. The way she corrected his use of the Goryeo-era verbal ending in a Joseon context? Masterful." "Professor, I don't understand. Why would anyone care about this?" "Because it's a perfect storm, Ji-won-ah." She could hear him settling into his chair, could almost see him pushing his reading glasses up his nose, a gesture he made when preparing to explain something complex. You have a wealthy man using language as a status symbol, getting it wrong, and then a working-class woman, at least that's how you're being portrayed, demonstrating superior knowledge. It's about class, education, and access to culture. It's become political. Politics. The word sent the chill through her. "I just corrected his Korean, Professor. I didn't mean to make a statement." "Nevertheless, you made one. Rather a powerful one, too." His voice softened. "Are you all right? Your mother said things had been difficult." "My mother has cancer. Late stage. The treatments..." Ji-won found she couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know the details." Professor Kim was quiet for a moment. "Ji-won-ah, your mother mentioned you might be interested in returning to research. Is that something you genuinely want, or is she pressuring you?" "I want it," and was surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "I've wanted it every day for 3 years, but the practical issues are surmountable. Listen, I mentioned this to your mother, but there's a research position opening in my department. It's a 1-year appointment, renewable based on funding. The salary isn't impressive, about 3 million won a month, but it comes with a research budget and full access to university resources. We're working on a project translating and analyzing documents from the Sonunsa Temple in Gyeongju. 15th and 16th century materials, many never properly studied. 3 million won a month. It was less than half what she'd made at Lotus Garden, even before tips. Professor, I appreciate this, but I can't afford. There's more. The project has attracted attention from the Ministry of Culture. They're interested in making the findings accessible to the public. Perhaps a documentary, certainly a book. If you were the lead researcher, there would be additional stipends, speaking fees, possibly consulting work. And, he paused, Jiwana, given this video situation, you might find yourself in demand. Universities, institutions, even corporations sometimes hire scholars for cultural consultation. Your face is becoming known. Jiwon stood and walked to the window, phone pressed to her ear. Below, Seoul sprawled in every direction, millions of people pursuing millions of different dreams, most of them destined for disappointment. I'm afraid, Professor. I've been away from academics for 3 years. What if I'm not good enough anymore? You corrected Middle Korean on the spot in a high-stress situation with perfect grammatical accuracy. You're good enough. But more than that, you're needed. Do you know how many people study historical Korean linguistics in this country? Maybe 50 seriously, perhaps 200 casually. Most of them are older scholars in their interpretations. You brought fresh eyes and innovative approaches. The field needs that. I need to think about it. Of course. But Jiwana, one more thing. That reporter you contacted you from the Hankyoreh Daily? She's legitimate. I know her slightly. She does good work, tends to focus on social justice issues. If you decide to speak with her, you should know she'll probably frame this as a story about educational inequality and class privilege. Are you comfortable with that?
I don't know what I'm comfortable with anymore, Professor. That's honest, at least. She heard papers rustling. Call me on Monday. We'll talk specifics about the position. And Jiwana, your father would be proud. Your mother is right about that. After they hung up, Ji-won searched for the video. She found it immediately, the first result when she typed Lotus Garden Waitress. The clip was just under 2 minutes long, filmed from a neighboring table. The angle wasn't great, and the audio was sometimes muffled by background noise, but the essential elements were clear. Park Dae-jung speaking in archaic Korean. Her response, his anger, her termination. The comment section was a war zone. This is what's wrong with Korea. Rich people think they can buy culture. She was disrespectful. Servers should know their place. Did you hear her pronunciation? That's Seoul National University level education. What's she doing working as a waitress? Another Chaebol abusing workers, nothing new. I looked up the guy, Park Dae-jung, Hansung Group. His father is worth 3 trillion won. Of course he gets away with this. The way she corrected him was perfect, polite but devastating. This is staged. No waitress speaks like that. Ji-won read until her eyes hurt, until the words began to blur together. Half the commenters were defending her, half were attacking her, and all of them were discussing her as if she were a character in a drama, rather than a real person whose life had just been upended. Her phone rang. The reporter again. This time, Ji-won answered. Hello? Is this EG1? This is Choi Min-ji from the Hankyoreh Daily. Thank you for answering. I've been trying to reach you. How did you get my number? I have sources at Lotus Garden. Look, I know this is overwhelming, but I'd like to meet with you. Your story is resonating with people. The video has been viewed over 500,000 times now, and it's still spreading. 500,000? Ji-won felt dizzy. The combination of class dynamics, linguistic expertise, and workplace injustice, it's exactly what people are talking about right now. There was a protest last week about Chaebol privilege. There are ongoing discussions about educational access. You've become a symbol. I
don't want to be a symbol. I just want—" What did she want? A job, her mother's health, her old life back. None of those things seemed possible anymore. "What you want is relevant to the story," Choi Min-ji said. "Can we meet tomorrow, somewhere quiet? I promise I'll be fair. This isn't about making you into something you're not. It's about telling the truth of what happened." Ji-won thought of Professor Kim's words. She'll probably frame this as a story about educational inequality and class privilege. She thought of Park Dae-jung's face when she'd corrected him, the shock and rage that she had dared to demonstrate knowledge he couldn't match. She thought of her mother saying, "Your father always said that knowledge without courage was just decoration." "Monday," Ji-won said. "There's a cafe near Seoul National University, Dalmun Cafe. Do you know it?" "I'll find it. What time?" 2 o'clock. I have somewhere to be in the morning." "Thank you. I promise you won't regret this." After hanging up, Ji-won wondered if that was a promise anyone could keep. Sunday passed in a strange haze. Her mother's friend, Mrs. Han, came down from the 4th floor with wedding preparations, invitations that needed addressing and formal calligraphy, place cards to be organized. Her mother worked slowly but steadily, her thin fingers surprisingly deft. Ji-won helped, grateful for the mindless task, for the ritual of brush and ink, for the way traditional calligraphy demanded complete attention. "Your mother tells me you might go back to university?" "Maybe. I don't know yet." "She is very proud of you, you know. Always has been. She used to brag about you to everyone in the building. My daughter's at Seoul National University studying Korean linguistics. We all thought you'd become a famous professor." Things changed.
They often do. Mrs. Han set down her brush and looked at Ji-won directly. But they can change again. My husband lost his job when he was 45. Everyone said he was finished. He started a small business, importing Japanese kitchenware. Now we're doing well enough to pay for a wedding that costs more than our first apartment. She smiled. Things change, then they change again. The trick is not to let the first change make you afraid of the second. That night, Ji-won couldn't sleep. She lay in bed scrolling through her phone, watching her life become a story told by strangers. Someone had identified her. Her full name appeared in several comment threads. Another person had dug up her undergraduate thesis and posted screenshots pointing out awards she'd won. A few people had found photos of her from her university days, and these were being shared alongside the video with captions like, "From Seoul National University scholar to waitress, this is Korea's lost generation." But not all the attention was sympathetic. Other threads had started analyzing her disrespect, breaking down her body language, her tone, her presumption, and correcting a social superior. One particularly vicious post had accumulated thousands of likes. "This is what happens when we give everyone access to education. They forget their place. Her parents probably went into debt to send her to university, and this is how she repays them, by getting herself fired and becoming an internet spectacle." Ji-won thought of her father, who had worked double shifts at the factory to save for her education. She thought of her mother, who had taken on extra piecework sewing to afford her textbooks. They had believed education was the path to a better life and had sacrificed everything for that belief. Had they been wrong? Had she failed them by not being able to transform that education into security, into the kind of success that would have justified their sacrifice? At 3 a.m., unable to sleep, she got up and went to her bookshelf. She pulled out her master's thesis, the physical copy she'd had bound, expecting to present it at her defense. The defense that never happened because she'd withdrawn from the program to care for her mother. The title page read, "Evolution of Honorific Markers in Royal Correspondence, a comparative analysis of Koryo and early Joseon epistolary conventions, 1350 to 1450. She opened her acknowledgments page and read, "To my parents who believed in me before I believed in myself. To Professor Kim Sonjae, who taught me to see language as a living thing, always changing, always revealing.
And to Korea itself, may we never forget the voices of our past. She had written those words 4 years ago, full of hope and certainty. That version of herself seemed impossibly distant now, separated not just by time, but by the vast gulf of disappointment and compromise. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Ji-won dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like armor. A simple black dress, professional but not expensive, her hair pulled back neatly. She left early, telling her mother she had an appointment, but not specifying what kind. Seoul National University's campus was exactly as she remembered. The trees lining the main pathway, the students hurrying between buildings, the particular quality of light that seemed different here than in the rest of Seoul, softer somehow, more contemplative. She had spent 5 years walking these paths, and her feet remembered the way to the humanities building without conscious thought. Professor Kim's office was on the 3rd floor, a small space crammed with books that had overflowed the shelves and now stood in precarious stacks on every available surface. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but his smile was unchanged. Ji-won. He stood and gestured to a chair that held 3 books. Here, let me move these. Sit, sit. She sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The office smelled of old paper and green tea, familiar and achingly nostalgic. Your thesis is still on my shelf, Professor Kim said, pointing to a bound copy identical to hers. I reference it sometimes in my lectures. Your analysis of the phonetic shift in honorific particles, it's still the most comprehensive treatment of the subject. Professor, I don't know if I can do this. The research position, coming back, it's been so long. 3 years. That's nothing in the scale of the career. But I understand the fear. You're worried you've lost something essential, that the time away has damaged your abilities irreparably. Haven't they been? Let's find out. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a document protected in a clear sleeve. The paper was old, the ink faded, the characters written in a style that predated modern Hangul. This is from the Sonunsa Temple collection, 15th century, probably around 1450. Can you read it? Ji-won took the document carefully. The characters swam before her eyes for a moment, and panic seized her. What if she couldn't do it? What if 3 years had erased everything? Then, like a language remembered from childhood, the patterns emerged. She could see the archaic verb forms, the honorific structures, the way the writer had incorporated Chinese characters into Korean grammatical frameworks. The meaning unfolded like a flower opening.
It's a letter, she said slowly. From a monk to a patron. He's requesting funds for temple repairs, but the language... She traced a character with her finger. He's using this honorific structure to indicate the patron is of royal or near royal status. And here, this verb ending, it shows obligation but also willingness. He's saying the repairs are necessary, but also that undertaking them would be an honor. The whole letter is structured to make the request seem like an opportunity for the patron to gain merit rather than a burden. Excellent! Professor Kim was beaming. What else? Ji-won looked closer. The handwriting is educated, refined. Probably the monk was originally from a Yongbon family. And the date, see this character? It's archaic, but it indicates spring. So this was written in spring, probably April 1450, just a few years after Hangul was introduced. Some of these characters show the writer was familiar with the new script, but still more comfortable with the old forms. And what does that tell you? That linguistic change isn't instant. Even after Hangul was introduced, educated writers continued to mix forms. The revolution in writing was real, but it happened gradually through exactly these kinds of transitional documents. Professor Kim sat back satisfied. 3 years and you can still read a 15th century document. I've been studying for months and add insights I hadn't considered. Your skills aren't diminished, Yuana. They're refined by life experience. You understand now how knowledge and class intersect, how education is both privilege and potential. That understanding will make you a better scholar. Ji-won felt tears threatening. The position, what would it entail? Translation works primarily.
The Sonunsa collection has hundreds of documents. Most have never been properly analyzed. You'd work here, in this building, with full access to the linguistics library. I'd supervise formally, but really you'd be working independently. We meet weekly to discuss findings, and you'd be expected to present at conferences, eventually publish. 3 million won a month? To start. And Jiwana, this video situation, while unfortunate in how it came about, has created opportunities. I've already had 2 universities ask if I knew who you were. They want you for lectures, workshops. The National Museum called. They're doing an exhibit on the evolution of the Korean language and thought you might consult. None of this pays a fortune, but together it adds up. Why would they want me? I'm not established. You're visible. You represent something people care about. Expertise emerging from unexpected places. Knowledge existing outside traditional power structures. Whether you want to be a symbol or not, you've become one. The question is whether you'll use that position to do meaningful work. Ji-won looked at the document still in her hands, at the careful brushstrokes of a monk 600 years dead, preserving his thoughts in a language that had evolved and changed, but still connected directly to modern Korean. She thought of her father, who had never learned classical Korean, but who had revered education as the path to a better life. Her mother wasting away in their small apartment, insisting that Ji-won's future mattered more than her present comfort. "I'll take the position," she said. "When do I start?" "Officially, next month when the funding comes through. Unofficially, whenever you want. Come by, read documents, use the library, refamiliarize yourself." He smiled. "And Ji-hwana, about that interview with the Hankyoreh Daily. Be careful. Reporters have their own agendas. But also be honest. Your story matters to people because it's true. Don't let anyone twist it into something it's not." The meeting with Choi Min-ji, the reporter, was both easier and harder than Ji-won expected. Dalmoon Cafe was nearly empty at 2 p.m., the lunch rush over, the afternoon crowd not yet arrived. Choi Min-ji was younger than her voice had suggested, probably early 30s, professional but not intimidating, with a directness that Ji-won appreciated. "Thank you for meeting me," Choi Min-ji said, setting down her recording device between them. "I know this has been overwhelming." Ji-won wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "I'm not sure what story you want to tell. The one you want to tell. This isn't about making you into a hero or a victim. It's about what happened when knowledge met privilege in that restaurant." The interview lasted 2 hours. Ji-won found herself speaking about her father's sacrifices, her mother's illness, the 3 years of invisibility at Lotus Garden. She talked about the moment when Park Daunting's arrogance had cracked something inside her, the split second when she'd chosen truth over safety. "What do you want people to understand?" Choi Min-ji asked near the end. "That education belongs to everyone. That knowledge isn't a luxury item for the wealthy to display, that my mother was right. Sometimes you have to stop being invisible." The article ran 3 days later under the headline, "The Waitress Who Refused to Disappear." Within hours, Ji-won's phone was ringing constantly. Universities offering guest lectures, documentary producers, publishers interested in her story. The first month was overwhelming. Interview requests, social media messages, both praise and criticism. Ji-won took the research position with Professor Kim while carefully selecting speaking opportunities that aligned with her values. The combination of income streams slowly eased the financial pressure, allowing her mother to continue treatment without the crushing desperation that had defined their lives. 6 months later, Ji-won stood in Professor Kim's office holding her first published paper on the sentence documents. Through the window, she could see students crossing the campus where she'd once walked as an undergraduate, then left, then returned. Her mother's treatment had stabilized her condition, buying precious time. The debt was still crushing, but manageable now with Ji-won's combined income from research
consulting, and speaking engagements. More importantly, her mother smiled again, really smiled, watching her daughter reclaim her voice. "You know," Professor Kim said, reading over her shoulder, "your father would have understood what you did that night. Knowledge without courage is just decoration. You chose courage." Ji-won looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not the invisible waitress she'd been, but the scholar she was becoming again. Outside, Seoul sprawled endlessly, full of people struggling to be seen, to be heard, to matter. She had learned something important in that expensive restaurant. Sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. The young monk's letter from 1450 lay on her desk, waiting for translation. 600 years ago, he had written asking for help, finding elegant ways to make his needs known. Ji-won picked up her pen and began to decode his words, giving voice to someone who had been silent for centuries. Some stories, she realized, were worth the wait. Ji-won's journey from invisible waitress to respected scholar shows that knowledge and courage can overcome any barrier. If this story inspires you, please like, share, and subscribe. It takes just a moment of your time, but helps these important stories reach others who need to hear them.